Oh, we're warming up. Warming up. Warming up. The Mondrian rectangles all light up. Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about one of the biggest cases to hit the legal world, the political world, the business world. It cuts across everything. Technology. It's the Google antitrust case, and let's get to it. So if you're new here, this is the Poised channel. I'm your host, John. We talk about some of the biggest legal, political, cultural issues of the day, and the goal here is to be as nonpartisan and as objective as possible, giving all sides of the story, and then ultimately my take as to what I think is really going on here and what the ultimate decision should be. We try to sift through the noise, think critically, and break down substantive issues into an easily digestible form. Without further ado, let's talk about the Google antitrust case. There's really a cruel irony to breaking up Google. The company that stands to benefit the most is Microsoft with its second-in-class search engine, Bing. And Microsoft, remind you, is the same company that underwent antitrust scrutiny in the year 2000 for its actions largely in the 90s when trying to compete with Netscape Navigator in the browser wars. Now, we're going to get into all of that soon, but it's important to remember at the outset that that antitrust litigation mired Microsoft in stagnation, little growth, and years of missing out on the next big things in tech, from social media to mobile, and most importantly, for our purposes today, search. Now that Google is hearing the antitrust music, Microsoft's Bing is poised to capitalize. And what I'll be referencing throughout this discussion and analysis is the Google antitrust order that was recently handed down by the district court in the District of Columbia. The link to the actual order, it's almost 300 pages. I went through all of it to prepare for this episode and to also write the accompanying article that relates to this discussion. You can find all of those links in the episode description. When you read that antitrust order, it will be readily apparent from the beginning that the Department of Justice wants you to think in the Microsoft framework. They want you to think that their case against Google is simply Microsoft circa 2000, because that's when Microsoft was found to have unlawfully maintained a monopoly in Windows and unlawfully tied its web browser to Windows. And it's clear that the DOJ has been successful to date drawing that comparison. After all, they just won this case here in the district court in the District of Columbia. And in that case, the judge held that Google has unlawfully maintained a monopoly in two product markets: general search services and general text advertising, through exclusive distribution agreements. We've yet to learn the court's remedy as of posting this video and as of writing the essay that broke down all of the issues in this case. But there have been murmurs that the DOJ is seeking to break up Google, and that's specifically focused with a divestment of its ownership in the Android operating system. Now, as a reminder, the same breakup remedy was initially the first one proposed in the Microsoft case back in 2000. The court in that case, the district court, wanted to break up Microsoft into two separate entities. But that was later reversed on appeal, and Microsoft was stuck with a consent decree instead. And we're going to talk about how actually a consent decree may have actually been worse for Microsoft than a clean break into two separate companies. We'll also compare the Microsoft case from 2000 to the current Google case in the next segment. But before I get there, I want to make one point abundantly clear. Google is not Microsoft circa 2000. Google may maintain a monopoly in search, but as any antitrust legal scholar will tell you, bigness is not badness. Not necessarily, at least. America and its judiciary system has long celebrated companies that achieve grand scale through innovation, quality products, strategic decision making, companies that basically get big naturally, organically. They don't get big by engaging in predatory pricing, price fixing, territorial allocations, all of like the classic ways of engaging in anti-competitive behavior in the market. As long as there are pro-competitive means that companies take to get big, we've generally said as a society that that's fair, that we want to promote innovation. We want to promote companies that are really good at innovating and creating quality products for consumers. But as I mentioned, problems, of course, can arise if that bigness is achieved through anti-competitive means. There's also a chief distinction that I want you to think about throughout this video, and if you also read the accompanying piece to this discussion, and that's that Google does not own the distribution channels, unlike Microsoft in 2000, which owned Windows, in which it distributed its internet browser product. It basically conditioned the use of Internet Explorer with the use of Windows. You couldn't get one without the other. Google, conversely, does not own the distribution channels for search, at least not entirely. It has some ownership in terms of the Android operating system for mobile, in which it includes Google Search as part of a number of Google products. It's a Google suite of apps that the mobile device manufacturers will typically sign up for when getting the license to use Google's products. So this distinction is an important one, that Google doesn't own the primary means of distribution, unlike Microsoft in 2000, and the district court largely glossed over this distinction. It's something that Google's lawyers will likely emphasize, or at least should emphasize more on appeal. Remember that in 2000, Microsoft had an almost 100% market share in operating systems with Windows. So when they told the PC vendors and basically anyone else buying Windows that you also had to include Internet Explorer, their web browsing product, preloaded on Windows, they were really able to throw their weight around, much more so than what Google arguably can do today. Google instead enters into arm's length contracts with distributors like Apple or Motorola or Samsung. They are an equal party with other big, sophisticated counterparts. And as a result, nobody is forced into using Google Search in the same way that many were forced into using Internet Explorer when they bought Windows back in 2000. Companies like Apple have decided that it's in their best interests to preload Google Search as a main feature within their Safari web browser. They've decided that it's better for their customers that they contract with Google and not, say, Microsoft Bing. And that's largely because, and the district court admits this, by the way, multiple times, it's largely because they view Google Search as a very quality product. So these 2 points, bigness not being badness, and the fact that there's a core distinction between what happened in the Microsoft case and what happened with Google in terms of owning the distribution channels, or at least the primary ones, they're really important here, because this case and the implications that it brings to Google are some of the most important in recent history. This case is probably the most important case to hit the tech world since Microsoft in 2000. Its ruling and any remedy that comes from it, whether it's the breaking up of Google, a restriction on some of these distribution agreements I'm referencing, whatever the remedy will be, is going to send shockwaves and will set a precedent for future antitrust actions against Amazon, against Apple, all of which are still pending with the DOJ and before a district court. We also have to address the fact that with antitrust law, it's very political, and there's tons of bipartisan support for this type of action against Google. So my perspective here may be a bit contrarian to the standard view that's held by many Democrats and held by many Republicans too. And that's reining in big tech, that the monopolies of Google have gotten out of control, and these companies need to be checked, their power needs to be curtailed, and they need to start allowing for smaller entrants to the marketplace. So we're going to address in this video whether that's even going to be feasible in the Google case, because as you'll find out as we discuss it more, search is actually a very hard business to monetize at scale with or without Google. But there's something even more important that underlines all of this, and that's the fact that do we as a society want to celebrate companies that achieve grand scale through innovation and quality products, or is there a certain point which companies become too big, even if they're doing great things in a pro-competitive way? Do they become too big? That's a philosophical difference people can reasonably have. So in this video, we're going to thoughtfully assess the antitrust case against Google. We're going to compare it to the Microsoft case from 2000, highlighting some of the differences I've introduced. We're going to then assess the likely remedies against Google, along with their implications. So what a breakup of Google could look like and what it could mean, not only for Google, but for the industry as a whole. And then we're also going to analyze what the court may have missed here. What's ripe for appeal in their ultimate conclusion that Google has an unlawful monopoly in general search and general search text advertising. And that's all through Google's distribution agreements. So let's first discuss why Google is not Microsoft circa 2000. Google's dominance in search has grown exponentially over the past decade. In 2009, it had about 80% of search queries in the US. That number multiplied to nearly 90% by 2020, with an even higher percentage on mobile devices at almost 95%. Microsoft's Bing is a second place search engine with around 6% of the market today. There are no other notable competitors here, by the way. Yahoo and even firms like DuckDuckGo, who also run a search engine, they rely on Microsoft for crawling and indexing the entire internet. They don't really have any infrastructure or capability to do that themselves. So they're effectively just another version of Microsoft Bing. It's important to note, though, that when I say that Google is not Microsoft from 2000, I do not mean that they have less market share than Microsoft. That would just be splitting hairs. They are both monopolies. I think anyone who takes a position saying that Google is not a monopoly is just being willfully blind. It's definitely a monopoly, but as I've mentioned at the top of this episode, how you become and maintain a monopoly matters. At least it does under antitrust law. And if you disagree with that, then we really need to think about how we can reshape and reform antitrust law, because bigness is not necessarily badness, at least currently under the law. What led Microsoft down a road of badness was how it changed its behavior once a big, new, hot, upstart competitor came on the scene in the browser wars back in the 1990s. Enter Netscape Navigator. Netscape Navigator had become the de facto product on Windows to browse the web. And this was in the mid-90s. Microsoft wasn't going to just let that happen. So they took two primary actions in order to try to compete and ultimately destroy Netscape Navigator. The first was to bundle its browser, Internet Explorer, with its Windows product, the distribution channel. Remember that. So customers would have the Internet Explorer web browser preloaded onto Windows when they installed the Windows operating system on their PC or bought the PC with it already installed. The Internet Explorer browser would already be there. The second step that they took was to pressure internet service providers and PC vendors to preload Internet Explorer on to Windows when they were selling computers. And they used their original equipment manufacturing license in order to do this. So in order to use the Windows product on, say, a Compaq computer, the PC vendor Compaq would have to get a license, an OEM license from Microsoft. And Microsoft would say, no, you're not using that license unless you agree to also install Internet Explorer. So they used this as leverage. They bullied PC vendors and ISPs and forced them into using Internet Explorer when nobody asked to use it. And that ultimately was the beginning of the end for Netscape, which was bought by AOL in 1998. Netscape just couldn't compete. They didn't own the distribution channel in Windows, which, as I mentioned, Microsoft had almost 100% market share in Windows. There were almost no other competing browsers out there. Mac was very small in market share, especially in terms of enterprise. Linux was out there, but they had maybe a percentage point or two in market share. Microsoft was the king in town. Now you contrast those actions taken by Microsoft with the actions taken by Google in the rise of search, and the stories are remarkably different. Google has secured default placement of their search product through distribution contracts with companies like Apple, which included as the default search in prominent areas like their Safari browser, although users can change that setting. Google has also entered into similar agreements with mobile device manufacturers and wireless carriers who use its Android operating system. And Google doesn't just do this for free. They actually pay huge sums to these distributors in order to place Google search in prominent locations. So it's arguably a win-win for everyone. The mobile device manufacturers and companies like Apple, who include it in their web browser, they get a share of the revenue that Google makes on search. It's typically calculated as a percentage of the advertising revenue that Google generates from queries run through the default search access points. So Google benefits, and the distribution channels benefit too. Apple could choose to contract with Bing, but it chooses not to. Bing can't monetize search as effectively as Google. Apple could choose to build its own search product, but it chooses not to. High barriers to entry. As of June 2024, Apple had over $60 billion in cash on hand. So don't tell me that Apple doesn't have the resources to build its own search product in-house if it wanted to. Not to mention the sophisticated teams of engineers, product managers, and they also have one of the senior leads from Google who joined Apple in 2018. So search has been on Apple's mind for a long time because they make over $20 billion a year in this agreement that they have with Google. That's right. $20+ billion per year as just one lump sum, a check that Google gives Apple annually. So imagine if, for whatever reason, Apple were to lose that. There would be huge implications to Apple's stock price if suddenly $20 billion disappeared overnight. If the Department of Justice said, Google, you can't enter into these types of distribution agreements with companies like Apple, Apple would actually be the one that's really screwed. So they would need to almost overnight try to develop their own search product or contract with someone like Bing or DuckDuckGo or whoever to try to fill the void and maybe also offer Google as an alternative. But as of right now, Apple chooses to use Google search. And think about who we're talking about here. Apple, one of the most closed source walled gardens in all of tech, has invited Google into their walled garden to be one of the primary features of the Safari web browser. Apple trusts Google with a key part of their user experience, searching and ultimately navigating the internet. That's huge. They wouldn't do that if Google were not a quality product. So the main point here is that Google is not applying the same leverage that Microsoft did to ISPs and PC vendors in its distribution agreements with companies like Apple. Apple freely contracts with Google. And back in the Microsoft days, nobody was even close to developing an operating system like Microsoft was. At least in today's era, there are other people that are, if not capable of doing search, are already kind of doing it, like Microsoft Bing. But Apple has made the decision that they don't want to compete head-on with Google for search. Instead, they would like to mutually benefit through their revenue sharing distribution agreement by promoting Google search and getting some of the ad revenue. But there is somewhat of an analogy between Windows and Google from Microsoft's case in 2000. And that analogy is the mobile Android operating system. A Google suite of products comes preloaded on Android devices that sign mobile application distribution agreements, but the device manufacturers pay no fee. They simply have to preload a few Google apps in exchange for the operating system. And Android is completely open source with competing app stores, including a specific app store that Samsung preloads on its devices that's run by Samsung. The inclusion of a Google suite of apps on Android devices hardly seems anti-competitive though, when the software is otherwise free, open source, and open to competition from other apps and app stores. This is very different from Microsoft bullying ISPs and PC vendors into conditioning the use of Windows on the inclusion of Internet Explorer. Android devices are not required to use Google's suite of apps, but like Apple for its Safari browser, they choose to primarily do so because it's quality and best in class. The district court undervalued this pro-competitive benefit to Google's distribution agreements, that the default inclusion of Google search actually makes the distributor's products better, not worse. Given that the court's decision turned on rejecting the pro-competitive nature of these agreements, let's look deeper at what the court missed and what might be ripe for appeal. Under US law, the offense of monopolization requires two elements. The first is the possession of monopoly power in the relevant market, and the second is the willful acquisition or maintenance of that power as distinguished from growth or development as a consequence of a superior product, business acumen, or historic accident. As previously mentioned, it's hard to debate that Google is not a monopoly, so let's just assume that prong one is always going to be met. Google is not going to appeal the district court's decision that it's a monopoly. What can be debated, though, is the distinction I've drawn earlier in comparing the Google case with Microsoft, that Google arose as a market dominant force because of superior product, superior business acumen, and just overall better strategy than competitors like Microsoft Bing. Microsoft arguably acted in the willful acquisition and maintenance of its market power in 2000, forcing Internet Explorer onto ISPs and PC vendors, whereas Google largely grew and developed as a consequence of having superior search products to its competitors. Mobile is a very illustrative example of how Google grew organically. The district court noted multiple times how Microsoft missed out on mobile. A big reason for this was they were mired in their own antitrust litigation, but the reality remains that Microsoft was just not as quick as Google to develop or purchase a mobile operating system or their own mobile search product. Google anticipated where the mobile computing market was headed and was quick to enter into exclusive distribution agreements with phone manufacturers like Apple. But instead of recognizing Google's strategic foresight, the district court placed more weight on the barriers of its exclusive distribution agreement and its effect of foreclosing other potential competitors from the mobile market. While that may be true to a degree, that completely neglects the freedom of distributors like Apple to contract with Google or to develop their own search product in-house. The district court also, in their opinion, does not really go into the economic impact of an iPhone, for example, without Google search preloaded on it versus the value of the iPhone without Google search preloaded on it. So Google actually makes the phone arguably a superior product, which has pro-competitive benefits. And the reality is that Apple would be making far less in revenue share from search with anyone else but Google. The arrangement is therefore pro-competitive and mutually beneficial. Another element that the district court missed here is that there's no smoking gun. And while that's not necessarily required in an antitrust action, it helps. And it has been evident throughout many other cases, including the Microsoft case of years past. What I mean by a smoking gun is that there's usually some type of direct evidence that a monopolist is using their power anti-competitively. That gets into the willful acquisition or maintenance of that monopoly power section of the law. Now, the district court will say, well, Google actually trained all of its employees not to say certain words so that they wouldn't flag or be found in discovery in antitrust litigation. But you could also make the flip side of that argument by saying that, well, Google was just trying to train its employees on how to communicate appropriately, which almost all regulators, and I can tell you this from having worked in a compliance role, almost all regulators expect you to train employees on appropriate communications. The district court, though, assumed that this was training may be done in bad faith to try to evade discovery or antitrust litigation, but I would actually tend to give Google the benefit of the doubt here in that they were just trying to train their employees on how to appropriately communicate and not use certain antitrust buzzwords that they either lack context for or didn't fully understand what they were saying. And that happens all the time when humans communicate. Let's use the Microsoft case as an illustrative example of a smoking gun being present. In the course of that litigation, evidence came out that Microsoft employees were describing their intent to extinguish rival Netscape and to cut off Netscape's air supply. There was no such evidence in the Google case. Similarly, in Standard Oil Company of New Jersey v. United States, John D. Rockefeller's company was found to have engaged in predatory pricing, undercutting competitor pricing, then raising prices significantly once competitors were out of business. They also used a system of secret transportation rebates that didn't really come out until the antitrust litigation. Google is hardly like the robber barons of the past, or even like Microsoft from 2000. The evidence of willful intent to extinguish rivals or cut off their air supply is simply non-existent in the Google case. The district court pointed to Google's exclusive distribution agreements as evidence of such intent, but as mentioned previously, there are numerous pro-competitive justifications for these arrangements, all of which were undervalued by the court. The district court even noted that Apple benefits and sells more iPhones by having their brand associated with the quality of Google search. This doesn't even account for the vast sums distributors like Apple enjoy from revenue sharing with Google on its search proceeds. So while the district court undervalued these pro-competitive benefits, it simultaneously overvalued Google's future search prospects. The DOJ, along with several states, filed this antitrust case against Google in 2020. What happened 2 years after this antitrust case was filed? ChatGPT. Some 2 years later, ChatGPT went live with the first generative artificial intelligence tool. The rise of ChatGPT and other generative AI products promises to change search forever. Generative AI has completely changed the prospects of search as a business. But despite this reality, the district court only made passing mention of generative AI. It failed to consider how this new technology could significantly disrupt Google's business model unless Google were able to innovate better than competitors with products like Gemini. The discovery and litigation that happened over the past 4 years neglected to consider generative AI largely because it didn't exist for much of the period. But it goes to show that even big tech firms with monopoly power are only one innovation away from obsolescence. As many who have experimented with generative AI to date can attest, it can do many of the same things as Google search, and it's only getting better while threatening to take even more of the search market share. Finally, and I cannot emphasize this enough, one of the other key areas that the district court missed is the fact that search is just a very difficult, complex business. The district court did recognize throughout its opinion that search is a difficult business, but it didn't place enough value on that reality as to why other competitors haven't entered the market since Google started achieving more and more dominance in the early 2010s. The district court constantly cited how few competitors have even tried to compete with Google apart from Yahoo and Microsoft. It used this evidence to support its conclusion that Google's exclusive distribution agreements are anti-competitive. But the district court should have placed greater weight on this question. Are the distribution agreements anti-competitive, or is the search business just really hard to monetize at scale? Regardless of who tries to compete in search, it's a highly capital-intensive business, and the district court even noted this, particularly in this section here. Google estimated it would cost Apple in 2020 about $20 billion to develop its own competing search engine, plus $7 billion annually to maintain it. That's more than 40% of Apple's current research and development expenditure in 2019. Google spent over $8 billion to operate search in 2020. Google spent over $8 billion just to operate, just to run their search engine in 2020. To this day, Google still spends billions of dollars per year to try to improve search and maintain its reputation as a quality product. So even if the government is successful in restricting Google's ability to enter into exclusive distribution agreements or forcing Google to divest certain businesses like Android, what is it really achieving? The costs of running a search product are unlikely to change unless generative AI technology makes it easier and more cost-effective to scale. But in the short term, this seems pretty unlikely. Before we explore what remedy the government might seek in the Google case, assuming Google does not win on appeal, let's first discuss why the government might want to seek a remedy in the first place. What are we trying to achieve by punishing Google? The district court admitted in this quote that it's unlikely a new competitor will arise in search. Therefore, even if the government restricts Google's ability to enter into distribution agreements with companies like Apple, what is it expecting to happen? A new search product from a new company magically appears? No startup wants to touch this space. Microsoft is even struggling to monetize this space. Microsoft, the world's most valuable company. If Apple loses out on some $20 billion per year in Google revenue share, they could be incentivized to build their own search engine. But once again, that would be just another big tech firm filling the void that Google left. How does that really help anyone? Unless there is some novel generative AI-like approach to search, it's unlikely that a new market participant will enter this space. These economic realities lead me to conclude that DOJ and states involved in this litigation are primarily seeking political points. If they can be viewed as checking monopolistic power, even if it was earned primarily through quality product innovation and strategic business decisions, as I would argue it was in Google's case, it's a win for all of the lawyers on the government's side. The political winds have shifted against Google, and few are interested in assessing whether Google's monopoly is truly anti-competitive. With that being said, though, what are the remedy options here? And is breaking up Google the most likely remedy? If you recall from the beginning of this episode, a breakup was the initial remedy that was ordered in the Microsoft litigation from 2000. While this was overturned on appeal and a consent decree was implemented instead, don't be surprised if a breakup is the first remedy ordered in the Google case as well. But while a breakup order would not surprise me, I think it's unlikely. If Google were forced to divest its ownership in, say, Android, that still would not address the court's objections to Google's exclusive distribution agreements, which is really at the crux of its unlawful monopoly, according to the district court. It would make little difference, therefore, for Google to spin off search alone, for it would still dominate that market. Products like YouTube, Waymo, and others under the Alphabet umbrella may support search to a degree, but the main economic engine of the company is still search in and of itself. Therefore, I think it's more likely that the district court will target the exclusive distribution agreements themselves. These were at the heart of its conclusion that Google maintains an unlawful monopoly. But for these agreements, it's conceivable the district court would have no issue with Google's market dominance. Accordingly, it's reasonable to expect a ban on Google entering into exclusive distribution agreements for search and search text advertising. If the district court thinks Google still wields too much power in search through Android, they might require a spinoff of that operating system. But I think that's less likely if the exclusive distribution agreements are put in check. It's important to note that this type of remedy, banning exclusive distribution agreements, would have massive consequences, not only for Google, but for Google's distributors too, primarily Apple. Apple in particular would potentially be out some $20 billion in annual revenue that they receive from Google as a lump sum. That's a huge amount, even for a company the size of Apple to suddenly be without on its balance sheet. Other mobile device manufacturers and browsers like Mozilla would need to find a new way to earn through revenue sharing agreements with competing search products like Bing. Perhaps generative AI products like ChatGPT, Claude, and others would jump into the search fray. Again, though, do you notice anything by the companies that I mentioned previously? No small startups, by and large. Even ChatGPT is owned largely by Microsoft. With Google hamstrung, the future of search could be Microsoft's market to seize. How that is helpful to promoting a decentralized market filled with smaller competitors is anyone's guess. If I were Google, though, I would try to do anything to avoid a consent decree. That's what Microsoft had to endure for years. Imagine basically some government employee looking over your shoulder for every innovation, product change, product rollout, new feature, literally anything to your business model that might be a little different than what it was before. You basically have to get that government employee's blessing. Think of how effective you can be as a business, having to review new products, features, and strategies with someone from the government who doesn't have your best business interests at heart. A clean breakup of Google may actually be better for the company in some ways. The value extracted from Android, for example, may benefit shareholders. The remaining company could hyper-focus on a few core areas. It could be a win-win all around. Regardless of what happens, though, the antitrust villain of 2000 is likely to benefit now the most. Cruel or maybe sweet irony, depending on your perspective. But that should lead us and the government to ask ourselves, what are we trying to achieve from the Google antitrust litigation? Reallocating market share in search to other big tech companies like Microsoft is unlikely to benefit anyone except those big tech companies. Think about that. Thanks for watching, listening, and please be sure to comment. I'm going to try to start doing these more consistently on a weekly basis, so be sure to hit the subscribe button, and I'll look forward to doing some critical thinking with you the next time. Cheers.